Morning light spilled through the grand glass windows of the Whitmore estate, where every curtain was pressed as flat as a page and each pane reflected the world with flawless clarity. This house wasn't just beautiful, it was a declaration by a powerful family that they could buy anything, even silence. From the outside, the mansion was a jewel nestled in a gated high society neighborhood. The hedges were trimmed so precisely it seemed like even the leaves needed permission to fall. But inside, where everything gleamed so brightly you could see your own reflection, there was a quiet emptiness that money couldn't fill. The children's room on the second floor was the only place in the house that still held a trace of warmth. Soft pastel blue walls, a small bed with a giraffe print blanket, and toys arranged in a perfectly imperfect chaos. It didn't follow the house's rules of perfection, but it overflowed with life. Grace stood there, wearing a dark, worn fabric dress, gently fastening the buttons on little Elliot's shirt. Her hair was streaked with gray, but her hands were steady like those of a seasoned artisan. She hummed softly, a lullaby woven with winters of biting cold and summers thick with sweat from the homeland where she'd grown up. "Hold still, sweetheart," she whispered, her hand brushing across the boy's forehead with the ease of muscle memory. Elliot giggled, a pure laugh untouched by status or skin color. "I'm not a baby anymore," he said, but still leaned into her palm like he was afraid the dream might disappear. Grace smiled. She'd heard that line 100 times over the past 3 years, ever since she first held the trembling boy in her arms after a nightmare. She remembered the first night he called out to her in a fever, "Don't go, please." For 3 years she had been the one who stood watch when the hallway lights went dark, the one who knew his voice would soften if she told the story about the bird who got lost from its flock, the one who stitched his stuffed animals back together, quietly, like it was a sacred ritual. But she wasn't his mother. Not officially, not in a way the world would recognize. To Victoria Whitmore, the lady of the house, who moved like she'd stepped out of a high-end magazine, Grace was just a name on the payroll. Every morning at exactly 8 o'clock, Victoria's heels echoed down the stairs like a programmed signal. Each step carried the chill weight of control, precision, and dominance. She never raised her voice. Women like Victoria believed anger caused wrinkles, and wrinkles were failure. Instead, she used clipped phrases that sliced emotion clean like a scalpel. "Grace, make sure the boy's clean before the guests arrive. No thank you, no eye contact. And don't wear anything that stands out." "Yes, ma'am," Grace replied, as always. No bowing, no bracing, just the calm steadiness of someone who'd learned how to exist in homes that were never meant for her. To the Whitmores, she was the backstage crew of a play where the spotlight never reached. But to Elliot, she was the entire sky behind the curtain. The one who knew he liked crustless bread, was afraid of thunder, and always tucked the biggest strawberry into the corner of his lunchbox. Maybe, in his eyes, Grace didn't need a title to be a mother. She just had to be the one who was always there. And sometimes, that was enough to create a love no contract could define. Grace always remembered the little things others missed. The bedtime stories that made Elliot laugh until he hiccuped, and the pages that made him cry for the characters he loved. She didn't need a planner or reminders. Her heart was where every detail of that boy lived. When Elliot fell, scraped a knee, or burst into sobs, he didn't cry for Mommy. He ran to Grace. Always Grace. Her arms were his shelter. No permission needed. No explanation required. But Grace had never crossed the line. She knew the rules in that house. No getting too close, no leaving a mark. She smiled when it was allowed, slipped quietly into the small room beside the laundry each night, and took the back stairs to avoid disturbing those who lived on the upper floors of a different world. And when Elliot was fast asleep, when the footsteps faded and the lights in the mansion dimmed into the soft amber of quiet, Grace retreated to her small, simple room, the only place she could be herself. On the worn wooden dresser, the top drawer held her treasure, a faded photo, its corners frayed by time and memory. In it, a little boy about Elliot's age with laughing, mischievous eyes. Micah. She had never spoken of Micah in this house. There was no need. Anyone who'd watched the way she held Elliot or heard the lullabies she sang when nightmares came would know she wasn't just caring for a child. She was loving a son the world had taken away. Each night before switching off the light, she pressed her hand to the photo, a silent greeting. "Sleep well, Micah." It was her ritual, a bridge between now and a grief-soaked past she had never allowed herself to mourn fully. The next morning, the Whitmore estate buzzed with unusual activity. Not out of joy, but out of the need for flawless performance. Victoria was hosting an outdoor event she called a refined gathering. In truth, it was a perfectly packaged display of subtle bragging. Refined in name only, florists moved in and out like soldiers on a battlefield, arranging imported roses with the precision of architects following a blueprint. The catering team used tweezers to place each hors d'oeuvre on gleaming silver trays. The lawn was mowed twice in the same day to ensure it met the highest standard of perfection, all for one goal: recognition from their own elite circle. Victoria floated among the staff like a conductor, her smile ever present but her gaze sharp enough to cut glass. Every word she spoke was soft but carried the weight of command, as if one wrong glance could get you dismissed from her orchestra. Grace was used to this scene. The blinding pursuit of flawlessness, the empty compliments for the little gentleman in his silk bow tie, never once mentioning how that same boy had burned with fever for 3 nights, crying for his mother, afraid of the wind, and how Grace had been the only one there to sit by his side until morning. "Grace?" Victoria's voice cut through, eyes never leaving the guest list. "You'll be present at the party, but only when necessary. Wear the Navy uniform, the simple one. I don't want you drawing attention." "Yes, ma'am," Grace replied again, her voice neither loud nor meek, just steady, like the breath of someone who's learned to live without leaving a trace. She never asked why. In this house, silence was a weapon of survival, and she had long since mastered how to wield it. That uniform hung in the closet like a long shadow, high-collared, stiff, the color of a thunderstorm. Grace took it down without feeling, neither warm nor cold, just doing what needed to be done. As her hands smoothed the iron over the fabric, a thought crept in. Strange, how something could fit so perfectly and still make you feel invisible. Downstairs, in the kitchen, buzzing with preparations for the lavish party, Elliot stormed in like a sudden gust of wind, his face smeared with chocolate, a bright red marker in one hand, and from his mouth came a shout that froze the room. "Moo me!" He ran straight to Grace, wrapping his arms around her legs like the world had narrowed down to just the two of them. His face glowed, unaware that he had just shattered the delicate shell of order Victoria worked so hard to maintain. And as if summoned by that one word, Victoria appeared right behind him, the sharp clicks of her heels striking the tiled floor like hammers pounding pride. She stopped, standing tall as a marble statue, her expression cold and unreadable. "Elliot," her voice was steel. Just one word, and all joy was gone. "How many times do I have to say this? Grace is not your mother." The boy froze. His wide eyes darted from his biological mother to the woman who had held him through every fevered night. He said nothing, just looked up at Grace, searching for confirmation from the person his heart already called Mom. Grace didn't react. Her face remained calm, but the hand she rested on Elliot's back began tracing slow, gentle circles. The only reassurance he needed to know he was still safe. "I'm sorry, Mama Grace," Elliot whispered, his voice soft as a feather, landing in a room built on rules. Victoria's jaw tightened. "That's enough," she said, as if cutting off a scene from a play she didn't approve of. That afternoon, Grace stood in the kitchen carefully cutting sandwiches into triangles, the way Elliot liked them. As she placed the strawberries on the plate, the head chef leaned in and murmured, "Sometimes I wonder who really belongs in this house." Grace said nothing, but the words echoed in her mind long after the dishes were washed. and Elliot was fast asleep. As night fell, the mansion grew quiet, like a stage after the curtain closes. Grace returned to her room, where the walls were painted in fading colors, and the single bed lay still, as if waiting for someone who always came home late. She sat down, still wearing her uniform, which now clung to her like a persistent memory. She opened the top drawer and took out a photograph worn soft by time. A little boy, round cheeks, sparkling eyes like a sky before the clouds smiled back at her from the other side of pain. "You'd be about Elliot's age now," she whispered, her voice cracking under the hum of the washing machine outside. Her fingers brushed the image, like touching a memory that would never return. "He's not like you, but he makes me feel like I've found something I lost." She put the photo away slowly, like placing a piece of her soul back into the drawer. Then she hung the navy gray uniform on its hook again, a garment that wasn't just clothing, but a disguise, a mask that turned her into a shadow. She closed the wardrobe door, locking the silence inside with it. By noon the next day, the Whitmore estate had transformed into a living portrait of upper-class sophistication. Sunlight danced across spotless white tablecloths, ironed so crisply that even a single crease could shatter the illusion. Silver platters gleamed, pastry trays bore French names, champagne seemed to spring from the earth itself. Everything whispered one truth: this wasn't a gathering, it was a performance. A soft jazz trio played near the fountain, notes floating in the air and blending with clinks of glasses and polite greetings. Laughter rose at perfect intervals as if rehearsed, just loud enough to sound friendly, but never real enough to reach anyone's heart. The air was thick with the scent of imported roses, but beneath every breeze another smell lingered, undeniable, unmistakable, the scent of pretense. The guests arrived one by one, gowns, heels, designer handbags in tow. They were doctors, lawyers, CEOs' wives, investors. Each looked as though they'd stepped straight out of a glossy magazine, where every detail was carefully curated, including who was allowed to be seen. And in the midst of it all, Grace moved silently, like a nameless shadow. No silk dress, no polished smile. But her hands had once wiped the tears of the very child they were now calling the perfect little gentleman. She wasn't there to be noticed, she was there to bear witness. Pearls sparkled on sun-kissed necks, like polished metal, expensive and cold. Every smile at the party felt like a quiet duel. No raised voices, only power plays exchanged through prolonged handshakes and darting glances. These guests didn't just enter with invitations, they came wrapped in bias, stitched into tailored dresses and dust-free suits. Wives of doctors, tech moguls, art collectors, each one hand-picked like part of a living collection Victoria Whitmore had spent years curating, and every one of them was white. A picture-perfect scene, at least on the surface. Inside the estate, Grace still moved through side corridors, a figure with shape and sound but no name. She crouched to adjust Elliot's collar, gently brushing crumbs from his cheek. The boy scrunched his nose and tugged at his bow tie. "It itches," he grumbled. "I know, sweetheart," Grace murmured, turning the button slightly so it wouldn't rub against his skin. "Just a little while longer." Elliot nodded, trusting her completely, with that innate faith children reserve for the people who love them most. Once he was ready, Grace handed him back to the adult world, a world of wine glasses, scripted compliments, and hollow laughter, and faded into the background like she'd never been there at all. The gray mule uniform dress made her blend into the estate like part of the architecture, rigid, quiet, nearly invisible. No one noticed the woman who had spent the morning scraping candy from children's shoes, or folding socks as small and delicate as bird bone. From the shadows of a dim hallway she watched Elliot. He held a juice glass with both hands like it was treasure, his eyes wide in a sea of strangers. He was searching for a familiar face. Meanwhile, Victoria glided across the patio like a veteran actress on stage. Every smile, every tilt of the head, executed with practiced perfection. She told curated anecdotes and spoke of Elliot as the picture of refinement, never once mentioning the woman who'd soothed his fevers or taught him his first thank you. Of course, there was no need to mention Grace. In a world built on status, some people existed only as furniture, useful but never truly present. A woman leaned over and said, just loud enough for Victoria to hear, "He's such a sweet boy. Absolutely precious." Victoria smiled, pleased, and replied with a rehearsed humility, "We've tried to teach him manners from an early age." Grace heard every word. She didn't turn around, but her grip tightened around the silver tray, knuckles whitening for just a moment. And then, the one thing no one expected happened. Elliot, standing beside his mother among the glittering crowd, suddenly turned his head. He saw Grace at the edge of the doorway, and his face lit up like sunshine breaking through a storm. Without a second thought, he shouted, "Nanny!" His voice rang out, pure and fearless. "Nanny Grace." Before anyone could stop him, Elliot bolted through the crowd like an arrow. One hand still held a half-eaten cookie, icing smeared across his tiny vest. He ran straight into Grace's arms, clinging to her like she was the whole world. The tray in her hands tilted slightly, but she held firm. Her eyes fluttered, not from imbalance, but from the tidal wave of emotion crashing in. Elliot looked up and beamed. "I saved you a cookie." Behind him, Victoria froze. Her face went rigid, a smile cracking like thin glass under pressure. All eyes turned. A nervous chuckle broke the silence. Somewhere a glass fell. Victoria forced a laugh, brittle as bone. "Oh, he gets confused sometimes," she said, her voice high and hollow. "Grace is our nanny." But Elliot didn't let go. He clung tightly to Grace's waist, burying his head into the freshly pressed uniform. The chocolate stain spread like a silent mark of love. He didn't know etiquette. He didn't understand social structure. He only knew one thing. Where he felt safe, that's where his mother was. And in that moment, every rule, every performance, every carefully crafted lie dissolved into nothing against the truth of a child's embrace. Elliot didn't care about the designer dresses drifting past him, the clink of crystal glasses, or the eyes scanning him like he was just another detail in a meticulously choreographed party. He didn't know the rules of etiquette or what good manners were supposed to look like. He only knew what safety felt like. And safety didn't live in the cold hands of his biological mother. It lived in Grace's arms, always soft, always waiting like a pillow made just for him. Grace crouched down, light as mist, meeting him at eye level. Her hand touched his chocolate-streaked cheek, wiping it gently without a word of scolding. Just a soft swipe, carrying with it 1,000 unspoken lullabies whispered before sunrise. "Found something sweet again, huh, little one?" she said softly, part affection, part self-preservation, trying to hold herself together. Her voice wasn't just filled with love. It was heavy with something deeper, a loss that had transformed into instinct. The jazz band resumed, almost robotically. Guests tried to find their rhythm again. Smiles, chatter, a swirl of activity. The party carried on as if nothing had happened, but the air had shifted. No amount of champagne could dissolve the feeling left behind by a child's voice and an honest embrace. In that moment, the golden hue of sunset began painting honey across the garden. The light draped over white tablecloths like a soft blessing. But instead of peace, it stretched the shadows longer. In that light, nothing could hide. Strands of fairy lights flickered on above, artificial stars trying their best to erase the tension still hanging in the air. Every detail, from the chair bows to the slightly angled wine glasses, to the exact sheen of Victoria's silk gown, was part of a tableau she had planned for weeks. And now, the moment had come. The speech. Victoria stepped into the garden like she was accepting an award. Her posture was perfect, her hand cradling a glass of rosé that sparkled in the light. Everything, from her stance, her glance, the precise curve of her lips, was controlled, as if someone were framing her through a camera lens. The music stopped, right on cue. Guests turned in unison, raising their glasses in anticipation. Compliments carefully rehearsed, were about to spill from the lips of a woman who had mastered the art of charming a crowd. Across the lawn, beneath the trellis, Grace stood by the serving table. She wasn't part of the frame. No one expected her to speak, to be acknowledged. Her role was to pour wine, clear glasses, and disappear. Victoria cleared her throat, her voice tightening like a string being tuned too high. To old friends and new to family, to beauty. But her words were sliced clean by a child's voice, bright and sharp as a bell ringing through a cathedral. "Mommy, I want to sit with Mommy." Everything stopped, like the universe had hit pause. The entire garden froze. One guest still held a raised glass. Someone mid-laugh forgot to blink. A soft gasp echoed, hard to tell if it was shock or emotion. Elliot stood alone, pointing straight at Grace. No confusion, no hesitation. His voice carried the purest kind of truth, the kind that only children can speak with their whole hearts. That call, "Mommy," ripped through the perfectly manicured evening like lightning cracking open a cloudless sky. No one moved, no one could pretend they didn't hear. One woman nearly dropped her wine glass, her mouth agape. A man nearby spilled champagne on his cuff, like his body refused to believe what had just happened. The garden fell into a strange, almost sacred silence. The wind stopped. Whispers rustled like dry leaves in a sudden draft. Did he just say? And then, in the stillness, all eyes turned to Elliot. He stood near the dessert table, finger pointing squarely at Grace like she was the only destination that mattered. No doubt, no apology, no shame. Grace was paralyzed. She didn't run. She didn't step forward. She just stood there, like an old oak struck straight through by a bolt of lightning. Victoria clung to her performance like a drowning woman to driftwood. Her mouth lifted into a smile, but it cracked like thin ice. The wine glass shimmered in her hand as if mocking her. She laughed, a brittle sound, sharp and hollow like shattering glass. "Kids, you know how they are." Her voice trembled just slightly. "Grace is just the nanny, that's all." But Elliot wasn't confused. Without a second thought, he weaved through the sea of silk gowns and polished leather shoes, threading past frozen stairs like they weren't even there. He walked straight toward the one person he believed truly belonged to him. He took Grace's hand in both of his tiny ones, looked up at her, eyes full of knowing, and asked, "Mommy, you love me the most, don't you?" The words rang out like a church bell, echoing into a space no one dared interrupt. The whispers stopped. Faces shifted, from surprise to something else, something unspoken. Someone turned away, someone's eyes welled up. Grace's heart clenched. Each beat in her chest pounded like war drums in the middle of a battlefield. She knelt down, her hands trembling as she wrapped them around his tiny fingers. Her voice caught in her throat, barely louder than the breeze. But every word she spoke sliced through the party's mask like a blade. "I love you so much, sweetheart, all the way down to my soul." Victoria stepped forward. Her face was no longer the flawless mask of makeup. It was fury, distorted and barely restrained. "Grace," she said through clenched teeth, her voice controlled but icy as steel. "Return to the kitchen, immediately. This behavior is unacceptable." That word, unacceptable, fell like a verdict, not on her actions, on her existence. But Grace stayed kneeling. She didn't argue. She didn't leave. She simply held the boy close, the same boy who had called her mom, in the middle of a crowd that had never once acknowledged she existed. Elliot clung to her neck, burying his face into her shoulder. The chocolate from his earlier cookie left a print on her uniform like a secret badge of love, and in that moment, amid quiet sobs and stunned silence, everything, the crystal glasses, the rehearsed stories, the couture gowns, faded away. All that remained was a child, a woman, and the truth. The party continued. Like a scratched record, it looped back to forced laughter, quieter music, dulled expressions, but the soul of the evening had already left. with grace. She climbed the back stairs in silence, as if afraid to break something else. Her body was stiff, not from fear, but from holding back a storm within. She didn't cry, she didn't scream. She just walked, every step filled with dignity and exhaustion. Her door closed behind her. No one knocked. No one called her name. She locked it, not to keep anyone out, but to let the pain roam free. The small room hadn't changed. Single bed, wooden dresser, a frayed rug, and the soft trace of lavender in the air like the scent of old memories. Not grand, not noble, but it held the only thing left untouched in that house, the fragments of a soul that had given everything without needing to be seen. And that night, in the room no one thought about, the truth finally had space to breathe. Grace sat at the edge of her bed, like her body had nothing left to give. The back of her uniform still bore Elliot's tiny, chocolate-stained handprint, and her heart still echoed with the question, "Mommy, you..." Her hands, still shaking, reached for the top drawer of the old dresser. Touching it always felt like a quiet battle, not just with the object, but with a flood of memory waiting to break through the moment it opened. The photo was still there, delicate and curled at the edges, as if time itself had tried to erase it. But the face in the picture had never faded, a boy, laughing wildly, hair tousled, one sock sliding down his ankle, barefoot, running, grinning like he'd just discovered freedom. Micah, her Micah. Grace pressed the photo to her chest and closed her eyes. A single tear slid free, tracing down her cheek, mixing with the scent of lavender. "I couldn't save you," she whispered, voice dry and brittle like wind scraping across old wood. "But maybe I saved someone else." And her mind was pulled back to the day no one ever wanted to remember, the day her world collapsed like a building with no foundation. The ER, fluorescent lights that felt like burning. Everything sounded like it had been wrapped in thick fabric, loud but meaningless. Micah burning with fever, coughing so hard it rattled his tiny ribs. She had begged, doctors, nurses, anyone. She had pleaded with them to see the fear in her eyes. But they told her, "Please take a seat." They didn't see her. They didn't see her son. And when they finally took Micah in, it was already too late. Sepsis. Nothing they could do. She remembered the moment the doctor said the words. The world outside vanished. Her mind went blank. And then it shattered. Her scream never made it to her lips. It echoed only inside her chest. Her knees hit the floor. No one caught her. No one understood. And from that day on, she was never the same, Grace. But she kept going, she kept walking, and eventually she found a reason to keep breathing. Not because she wanted to raise someone else's child, but because the mother in her heart didn't know how to stop beating. The love she had needed a place to go, and it found its way through children who didn't share her name, who carried none of her blood, but who needed arms like the ones she had once opened for Micah. Then came Elliot, with applesauce on his chin and eyes wide with fearless wonder. That first hug didn't feel like a meeting. It felt like a door creaking open, allowing her heart to crack again, not from pain, but from the courage to love once more. Grace looked up at the wall. Taped there at a crooked angle hung a crayon drawing, a messy sketch of two figures, a small child holding hands with a grown-up in a triangle-shaped dress. Above them, in shaky letters, it read, "Mom, Grace." Her throat tightened. Her fingers brushed the paper like it might vanish if she touched it too hard. She had poured every motherly instinct she had into other people's children, telling stories, singing lullabies, kissing scraped knees, cutting the crusts off sandwiches. Each small gesture was a brick laid quietly in a maternal bond no one ever acknowledged. Every one of those acts had been a whisper to Micah. "I'm still loving you, just in a different way." And even if she'd just been cast out of a sacred moment like an outsider, Grace knew she had never stopped being a mother. She had simply become one in silence. The next morning the mansion looked exactly the same. The floors still gleamed. The flower arrangements still matched the color palette. But the air was different. Something had cracked. You couldn't hear it, you couldn't see it, but everyone felt it. It wasn't the kind of change you could name. It was a fracture, quiet, deep, and beyond repair. Victoria sat in the sunroom, fingers turning a porcelain teacup, as if it were the only thing she still controlled. But she didn't drink. The scent of cooling tea mixed with a bitterness rising in her throat, the taste of shaken power. Her face was still, a porcelain mask, but her jaw was tight, the muscles twitching beneath well-maintained skin. She'd spent the night calling friends, spinning the story into some innocent mix-up, chuckling through clenched teeth like she was scraping away at her own pride. But the shame didn't fade. It boiled just under the surface, like water ready to spill over. She crossed a line, Victoria thought, and right in front of my guests. Just then Charles walked in. He looked like he'd stopped by between meetings. Suit still perfect, briefcase still in hand. In this house he was rarely present, and never a source of comfort. But today Victoria needed a nod. She needed someone to share the weight of the decision she didn't want to carry alone. "She's getting too attached," Victoria said, eyes fixed on her untouched tea. Charles raised an eyebrow, indifferent. "Grace, she embarrassed me in front of everyone," Victoria replied, a flicker of long-held anger finally breaking through. "Elliot called her Mom, as if that's normal." Charles crossed his arms, leaning against the doorway, weighing the matter like a quarterly report. "If it affects the family image, just let her go. Simple. We'll hire someone else." That was it. No argument, no emotion. And for Victoria it was enough. Enough to convince herself this wasn't cruelty, it was necessity. That afternoon, Grace was summoned to the study, a room she rarely entered unless to lay fresh linens or file paperwork. The air always smelled like old books and unwritten rules. She walked in, hands folded in front of her, her face as calm as ever. But inside, a storm raged. One glance at Victoria told her the door was about to close. "We've made a decision," Victoria said flatly, her voice as cold and dry as printed text. "This month will be your last." No apology, no kindness in her eyes. Just a formal termination, delivered with the bare minimum of civility. Grace didn't flinch, not because it didn't hurt, but because she was used to pain having no audience. "I understand," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, as though she were speaking to herself, not her employer. And then a scream burst from the hallway. "No, no, no, no." Elliot, he stormed in like a small hurricane, his face red from crying, his eyes wide with terror. The heart of a child doesn't analyze, it just loves. "And breaks?" "No," he cried out. "I don't want Mommy Grace to go. She's mine." He wrapped his arms around Grace's legs, sobbing without shame, without fear of who was watching. That explosion of emotion, innocent and fierce, ripped through every false curtain in that cold, curated house. Victoria rushed over, her face flushed with a cocktail of rage and humiliation. "Elliot, stop it right now. You're making a scene." But the so-called scene had begun long before. It wasn't in the cries of a child. It was in the truth everyone had been pretending not to see. From the kitchen doorway the chef stood frozen, hands still dusted with flour. Another housekeeper paused mid-step in the hallway, eyes brimming with tears. No one said a word, but their eyes spoke volumes. They saw everything. They knew everything. Grace bent down, her gaze never leaving Elliot's face. She didn't need to say a word to prove her love, only pressed her hand gently to his cheek, wiping away the hot tears. Amid the chaos, a strange kind of stillness settled in, a moment where an undeniable truth could no longer be ignored. "It's okay, sweetheart," Grace whispered, her voice as soft as thread. "You're going to be just fine. I promise." But Elliot shook his head, tears streaming. "I don't want you to go," he sobbed. "You're my mommy." Grace's heart clenched like a fist, not because she was losing her job, but because she saw something the child hadn't yet learned, that love, no matter how real, doesn't always win against power, and that those who give the most are often the ones without a final say. She rose to her feet, smoothed her dress, and said with a calmness that ached, "I'll start packing my things." Victoria gave a short, cold nod. Charles had long since left the room, leaving behind a silence that chilled. Elliot still clung to the hem of her dress, his tiny hands gripping tight, refusing to let go. But Grace, with every ounce of tenderness she had left, slowly pried each finger loose from the fabric. It wasn't rejection, it was a goodbye wrapped in gentleness. And so, the woman who had lulled someone else's child to sleep, with lullabies bearing no shared name, walked out of the only heart that had ever called her mom, and truly meant it. A week passed. The Whitmore estate gradually returned to its flawless order. Fresh orchids were placed in the foyer, the banister gleamed again with lemon polish, and every toy vanished as if a child had never lived there at all. No one mentioned Elliot's screams in the study. No one spoke of the look in his eyes when Grace said goodbye. The Whitmore family carried on as though nothing had happened. That was their particular skill, leaving behind anything that didn't fit the portrait they wanted to hang on their walls. Victoria threw herself into planning the annual charity gala. For her, it wasn't about goodwill, it was a photo opportunity, a moment to appear in the press lit just right, more perfectly curated than ever. The gown she chose wasn't for beauty, it was for how well it photographed. Guests returned to the estate like a runway on the move. Tailored suits, polished shoes, and smiles so rehearsed they could have been pre-programmed. The centerpiece of the evening was a special guest, Dr. Lena Hayes, a young black woman celebrated by Forbes, a rising star in pediatric medicine. Lena didn't enter like the others. She didn't need to force presence. From the moment she crossed the gate, heads turned. Her skin glowed under the late sun, her natural hair tied in a proud bun, her custom suit hugging a posture shaped by confidence and grace. She nodded politely at each person, warm but never fake. And then, as she approached the corridor connecting the kitchen to the garden, her eyes locked onto something that made her stop. There, just beyond the archway, a woman in a grey moor uniform, carrying a tray of pastries, head bowed slightly, as if trying not to be seen. Race. Lena's heart tightened, as if time reversed, dragging her back into a memory long folded away in the drawers of her mind. She stood frozen, then took a step, then another. Surprise, emotion, and something stronger, resolve, drove her forward. She didn't need to think. She couldn't take another step without moving toward that figure. Grace, her voice trembled, not from fear but from emotion surging too fast to contain. Grace turned. Her face, as calm as always, froze when her eyes met Lena's. Older now, successful, radiant, but still the same eyes. And in that second the world paused. The background noise faded. A reunion between the one who had once given hope and the one who never let it go. Grace lifted her chin, and in that suspended moment, time exhaled. Her eyes widened, her lips parted like she was answering a prayer whispered years ago. Nina. The name slipped from her lips like it had been waiting there, quietly, all along. They embraced. No words needed. The kind of hug that erases years. No longer just a maid and a prestigious guest. Just a woman who once planted a seed and another who was now blooming because of it. "I can't believe it," Lena whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't know you were here, Miss Grace." Grace pulled back slightly, still holding Lena's hands tight, her gaze softening as if casting sunlight over the child she once knew. "Look at you," she said. "You've truly grown." Lena smiled through her tears. "You were the first person who ever believed in me. When I was just a rebellious kid lost in the system. When no one expected anything from me except you. Do you remember you brought books every week? You sat and read with me, even when I refused to listen. You said I was smart, before I ever believed it myself." Grace smiled softly, eyes shining but full of pride. "I always knew you'd become the person you were meant to be." Lena swallowed hard. "Today, I'm a doctor because of you. Everything I have, everything I am, Started with you. Grace gave a small nod, trying to hold back the tears still clinging to her lashes. But she couldn't. Around them the chatter faded. A hush swept over the once bustling garden. Heads turned, champagne flutes hovered mid-air, cameras lowered. Every gaze fell on the two women, one glowing in her triumph, and one standing like a candle newly lit. A woman leaned toward Victoria and whispered, "Who is she?" Victoria froze. The face that had beamed for photos just moments ago now stiffened. "I thought she was the nanny." Lena turned, still holding Grace's hand, this time facing the crowd. "Him's not just a nanny," Lena said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. "He's the reason I'm standing here today." And in an instant, the story everyone thought they knew about Grace, the woman in a uniform carrying a tray, moving quietly through other people's lives, changed. She was no longer the backdrop to someone else's portrait. She was the focus, the one who planted seeds where others saw weeds, the gentle light that existed in places no one cared to look. The way people looked at her shifted, no longer a passing glance as if she were part of the decor. Now they looked at her like someone with a story they'd all missed. Grace's silence became strength, her quiet a voice, and though there was no spotlight, no podium, this was her triumph. In that lavish garden, surrounded by champagne and roses, in the place where she was once pushed to the edges, she now stood in the center, with a truth no one could deny. Grace, who once had no right to be called Mom in a home she loved like her own, was now being called by her name, not with a title, but with gratitude, with life, and with a kind of love that creates people like Lena. Lena Hayes stood there, her hand still gently resting on Grace's shoulder. In a party scripted down to the last detail, this moment arrived like a summer storm in a desert, unannounced, unscripted, and blindingly real. Her voice rang out, calm but unwavering. "I wasn't planning to speak today, but I can't stay silent." She looked around, locking eyes with powdered faces, the very ones who had once never looked Grace's way, now hanging on every breath. "This woman standing next to me, maybe some of you never noticed her, maybe you called her the help. Maybe you never even called her anything at all." Her voice caught for a beat, then steadied. "But let me say this. Women like her raised women like me." The air shifted. A few exchanged glances. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else lifted their glass, as if to shield their own guilt. "Don't you ever call her just a nanny," Lena said, her voice etching each word into the moment, "where I had nothing. No family, no direction, no belief in myself. She gave me time. She gave me gentleness. She talked to me like I mattered, when even I didn't know how to stand on my own." In the distance, Victoria stood frozen. The glass in her hand tilted slightly, liquid trembling inside. Like the image she'd spent years crafting was starting to crack. "And it wasn't just me," Lena continued, her voice softening into something deeper. "She's quietly poured love into the hearts of so many children. Over a decade. In rooms no one looked into, in moments no one thought were worth remembering." The crowd held its breath. Someone silently raised a phone. A red light blinked, and another phone lifted, and then a caption appeared online. "This woman just changed everything." Within hours, the video spread across social media. Thousands of strangers left comments. Mothers, children who'd grown up in the arms of women like Grace. They began to share their stories. One former student wrote, "She taught me how to read when my parents didn't have the time." A woman living overseas posted a childhood photo, herself sitting in Grace's lap, and wrote, "She gave me more hugs than my own mother ever did." Meanwhile, Victoria's inbox flooded with messages, emails, and interview requests. People who once walked past Grace without a glance now rushed to claim they had always appreciated her contribution. A brittle, transparent kind of dishonesty. You and Charlie, rarely present when needed, approached awkwardly. "Maybe we overreact," he mumbled. "I mean, with all this attention, should we consider keeping her?" But Grace, she didn't need to be angry. She didn't need to defend herself. She didn't need to raise her voice. She simply stood there, like an old tree that had weathered every storm, calm in the way only someone with nothing left to prove could be. "I won't stay," she said gently, her voice soft but unwavering. "Not in a place that only accepts me if I stay silent." Charles bowed his head. Victoria opened her mouth as if to object, then fell silent, because some truths deserve no rebuttal. For the first time, the story didn't belong to the Whitmore family. It wasn't about their rules. It wasn't about a role Grace had to shrink herself into. Now the story was hers, and for the first time the world listened. The day Grace left the pristine white mansion, the sky was clear as glass, as if even nature understood. This wasn't a defeat. It was a release, a quiet revolution. She didn't take much, just a small suitcase, a few cherished mementos, and one folded crayon drawing tucked safely in her coat pocket. A woman in a triangle dress, holding hands with a smiling child. Above them, scrawled in blue crayon, "Mommy Grace." She didn't cry as she passed through the marble foyer one last time. She didn't look back at the staircase where Elliot had once called her Mom in front of everyone. But when she reached for the mansion gate to leave, footsteps pounded behind her, fast and frantic, like a heart skipping beats. Wait, Elliot came running, his small legs racing across the stone path, cheeks flushed, clutching the hem of her coat. "Uncle, please." Grace dropped to her knees, cupping his little face in her hands. The wind tousled his hair. Her eyes shone with the light of an old wound that never fully healed. "You'll always be in my heart," she whispered, voice full of love, trembling with sorrow. "But you belong with them now, Elliot. Be strong, be kind, and remember what I taught you, especially when no one's watching." He nodded, his eyes wet. She kissed his forehead one last time, then rose, walking away with her head high, her steps light as if she'd finally set down the heaviest burden she'd ever carried. The gate closed behind her, not like a door shutting tight, but like wings opening toward freedom. 1 month later, on a quiet street with no signs or fanfare, a modest building opened its doors. No marble, no crystal glasses, just windows painted by tiny, colorful hands, and a sky-blue sign out front with 5 simple words: "Micah's house, where hearts heal." Inside, laughter echoed. Real laughter. Crayon marks lined the walls. A cozy, treehouse-shaped reading nook sat in the corner. Rows of tiny shoes lined the entry. Some of the children still flinched when spoken to. Some had just lost their moms. Some didn't trust anyone. Yeah, but they laughed, and slowly they began to believe again. At the center of it all was Grace. Clipboard in one hand, a paint-speckled teddy bear from morning art class in the other. She no longer wore a uniform. She wore something far more beautiful. Kindness now second skin. People offered her book deals, asked for her memoir. Organizations invited her to lead programs for grieving families. One council member even offered to fund a larger center, but Grace started small because she knew children didn't need castles. They needed eyes that listened, arms that held them, and someone willing to wait until they were ready to trust again. In the corner of Grace's small office hung a simple frame. Inside it, a wrinkled crayon drawing, its corner torn. 2 stick figures holding hands beneath a smiling sun. A scrawled message: "Elliot, Mommy Grace." She didn't hang it to be praised. She hung it to remember, because Grace didn't just leave a house. She built a home from grief and from learning how to turn it into purpose. Every child who walks through the doors of Micah's house doesn't just find someone to care for them. They find someone who sees them, someone who stays, someone who doesn't turn away when they cry, doesn't flinch when they're angry, and never gives up on them when they need belief the most. The last light of day spills across Micah's house, bathing it in golden hues, as warm as honey. Tiny windows glow like paper lanterns, flickering with the movement of joy inside. Small hands swing paintbrushes. Bright laughter fills the rooms. Shoelaces are tied with patient fingers, and Grace moves through it all like a quiet stream. Steady and gentle, she kneels to listen as a little girl whispers a secret in her ear. She smiles when a boy hands her his first drawing, a house with giant windows. She softly embraces the child, startled by a loud sound just outside. There are no standing ovations, No spotlight, only love, present in 1,000 moments no one else sees. She no longer wears the stiff uniform or the restrained expression from the Whitmore estate. Now her laughter is real, her eyes are honest, her presence is whole. She is no longer a shadow behind someone else's story. She is the heart of many. As the sun dips below the treetops, shadows stretch gently across the floor. The children gather around her in the main activity room. One curls up into her side. Another tugs at her sleeve, asking her to keep reading. She reads to them, her voice calm and smooth like a lullaby. One hand turns the page. The other rests on the small back, leaning into her chest. No lectures, no accolades. Is something quiet and deeply true. Motherhood isn't measured by blood. It's measured by love, sacrifice, and the kind of unwavering presence that never walks away, the kind that shapes a child's soul.